I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. And while I'm doing that, thank Julia for putting all this together, not only this individual series, but all the other stuff she's done before. So really cool. Happy to be a part of this. And hopefully, Julia, you can give me a nod. Can you see that okay? All right, excellent. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us tonight. I'm not sure how many folks we've got. Maybe we'll get a few more as we go along. We're going to talk about something that is near and dear to my heart, mainly because it's the primary purpose of my job. What I focus on and what the topic for tonight will be the management of the different natural resources that are found in Raleigh parks, but not just the parks. I think Raleigh parks gets used a lot as sort of a system-wide term, but I want to point out that it includes not only parks, but also nature preserves, greenways, and various types of open spaces that we have and manage. So we'll start with a quick presentation outline. Quick warning, I do have a tendency to be a little long-winded, and Julia has promised to give me a 15-minute warning because I do want to leave some room for questions at the end. But we're going to start with just a quick slide on what natural resources are, or at least how we're referring to them in this sense. We're going to talk a little bit about habitat patches and corridors, different monitoring and inventory strategies we use, as well as different habitat management strategies we use. We'll touch on the partnerships that we have been fortunate enough to form that help us meet a lot of shared goals. And we'll talk about different collective action initiatives that the city has become a part of. We'll round it out lastly with some things you as individuals can do to help, or as groups, whether it's your neighborhood or some other community group. And we'll hopefully, like I said, leave some room for questions at the end. All right, so what are natural resources? When I talk about natural resource management, what am I talking about specifically or even broadly? Um, of course, as many of you probably already know, this term can mean a lot of different things, especially depending on the perspective you're coming from. From the consumptive kind of energy production side of things, natural resources could be natural gas, petroleum-based products like oil and gasoline. It could mean other commodities like timber, wood we need to build houses, things like that. Elements that we gain through mining. But what we're actually using the natural resources term here is to sort of encompass the different components of the various ecosystems and other natural elements that interact in order to help shape not only landscapes as we see them as a whole, but the different ecologies that go along with those landscapes. Typically, resources are kind of broken down into the non-living and living aspects. So the abiotic or the non-living components we'd like to consider are different soils, geology types, topography, which refers to kind of the slopes and the aspects of the land, the different water courses that may exist on a site, whether that's a stream, a river, a lake, a wetland. Could even mean how the surface flow from rainfall moves through the site. Collectively, that's all kind of referred to as the hydrology. We look at the weather and the climate. All of that influences what sort of landscape and ecology you have. And lastly, fire. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but that's really meant to represent the different types of disturbance that can happen in an ecosystem. The biotic or the living aspects we look at obviously are the different plants, whether that's the vascular plants, which are the plants we commonly think of, the trees, the grasses, the flowers, things that have vascular tissue that will move nutrients and water around. But just as important are the non-vasculars, where you're talking about mosses, lichens, fungi, liverworts, all that sort of stuff that often gets overlooked. In the biotic aspect, we also have the wildlife, whether that's animals under the different taxa, insects, arachnids, or even microorganisms, things in the soil or in the water that help facilitate different processes. And speaking of processes, one of the other things that we look at are the different processes that would have occurred or that we hope to continue to occur within a system. So whether that's the succession of a habitat or of an ecosystem, whether that's the resilience or stability, Reproduction and dispersal is also really important because how else is a species supposed to propagate and maintain its population? And finally, we need to find a way to connect all these resources. So we have various wide-ranging amount of resources. How can we connect them so that they continue to maintain that interaction and maintain some of those processes? One of the most common questions I get is, how do you all in Raleigh parks approach wildlife management? And I think the easiest answer, that's really habitat management. It's pretty rare for us to actually go out and physically manipulate a wildlife, an individual wildlife species, whether sometimes if it's a nuisance species or if it's something that's incredibly rare, something that's injured, that's when we're actually physically dealing with the wildlife themselves. Most of the time, we're trying to prepare that habitat or improve that habitat so that it becomes suitable for their needs. And those needs could be either an individual plant or wildlife species, or it could be a group of plant or wildlife species. Again, we really try to focus on connections. How can we connect certain types of habitat to other similar types of habitat in a way that allows for dispersal? We are actively writing management plans for a lot of our properties that prescribe different actions we can take to help and maintain and improve these habitats. And we are actively working with the city council and other members of the city government to address planning and zoning ordinances that may help protect those connections, rather. So in terms of development, we know the city is still growing. There's not much internal growth that can happen within the city, let's say within the inner belt line, but we are continuing to sprawl outwards. And so we need to look at how we can maintain some of these connections as we continue to grow. And finally, I had to drop the Field of Dreams quote, "If you build it, they will come." For a long time, that was the conventional wisdom of wildlife management or habitat management, was to create the habitat and the plant or wildlife species would move back in. Not necessarily true, especially when you're talking about a heavy urban environment like us. So there's additional steps we have to take, and we'll get into some of those here in a little bit. All right, so you'll hear me refer to habitat patches and corridors quite a bit. Um, Essentially, what that means is, habitat patches are these larger areas where a plant or wildlife species can find the needs or find the resources it needs in order to persist and reproduce. Now, once those levels get to a certain amount, or if it's a species that needs a wide range, they need to be able to disperse and move around, which becomes even more constricted in an urban environment like Raleigh. So we look at our greenway system, our utility right-of-ways, and the different riparian buffers, which are around the streams and rivers. The Neuse River is a great example, but also Crabtree Creek, Swift Creek, Walnut Creek. All these serve as kind of hallways or corridors for not only animals, but plants too, to move along and to continue to establish new populations, replenish old populations. And it really is a vital resource. When we connect these habitat islands in this urban setting, that, as I have here in this bottom bullet, is one of the greatest services we can provide as a park system or as a greenway system to the environment, because we understand that development is going to happen. How can we do our best to mitigate the impacts that may have on different plant and wildlife populations? I threw this map in. It's not the best map, but I feel like it illustrates pretty well what I was talking about. This is Southeast Raleigh. You can kind of see the inner belt line coming down almost from like northwest down to the south. That's 87, or what was once referred to as 64, 264, heading out to the east. So you can see all the light green and the darker green polygons, the shapes, represent larger habitat patches. And these smaller, more narrow lines and shapes represent the greenway easements and corridors we've established in order to help perpetuate this connectivity, this network of dispersal for wildlife. So you can see we're still, with what we're doing a fair enough job, but there's still so much development around there where it becomes ever more critical for us to maintain and improve these areas and make them more suitable for not only habitat, but for moving through as dispersal corridors. All right. So what's one of the most important things we can do as a park system, aside from, again, creating that system of connectivity, is to look at these areas, our habitats and our corridors, and determine not only what type of species are using these, whether it's for breeding habitat, year-round habitat, migratory type habitat, but when they're using it and how often. Knowing what we have can help inform our management plans and all future action. And it can help us identify some things that are rare or protected that we may not have expected to be here, but through constant monitoring and collecting biological inventories, we may be able to become aware of and then put in different management strategies to take care of that. We like to look at historic inventories, things that we've collected, from the 60s, 70s, 80s, and on. That helps us give us an idea of what was once there and maybe what should be there, what we can maybe expect when we take X type of management action. And again, like I mentioned earlier, the type and the number of species, as well as when and how they use these different corridors and habitats, all of that is considered when we go into planning our management actions. When it comes kind of to the smaller scale, what do we actually do in a given site or a given greenway stretch that helps preserve or maintain these habitats? A lot of what we do focuses on vegetation management. That could be native or non-native vegetation, and we'll get into that on the next slide. Another thing we look at is non-native invasive wildlife. Now, typically in our setting or in my experience from what I've had to deal with in my role, we're talking about insect pests. We're talking about emerald ash borer, spotted lanternfly, gypsy moth, different things like that that can come in and have a huge impact on tree species or other types of plants. And ultimately that could shift systems, native wildlife distributions, also all sorts of stuff like that. Nutria may be a better example of sort of the macro fauna that would be non-native, but we haven't had to deal too much with that, thankfully. We sometimes will approach hydrological restoration if and where it's appropriate. So, for example, we do have a series of impoundment dams, things that were relics of old agricultural practices. And there are situations where we can either remove whatever that impediment was or do things to improve that system so that the hydrology restores close to what it was probably before those practices were put into place, trying to reduce those past disturbances and those impacts and bring back certain benefits associated with those systems. Something we're starting a little bit more is prescribed fire, and I'm going to get into that on a future slide here in a couple. And lastly, one of the big things we do is we protect and we preserve these green spaces. So by becoming designated as a park or a preserve or greenway open space or whatever, it carries along the certain protections that Raleigh Parks has put into place for these areas. There are different development guidelines and how you can manage these sites in order to help maintain those natural elements that are beneficial not only to plants, but also to wildlife. All right, so vegetation management, like I said, this is a key component of what we do. A lot of it deals with whether it's a native plant or a non-native plant. A lot of non-native plants we are actively looking to either remove, suppress, or control. There are certain plants like stiltgrass, Japanese stiltgrass, which is so prevalent in the system, in the area. Japanese honeysuckle is another good one where we can only really hope to control that and manage that as opposed to eradicate it. There are other species, predominantly woody species, that we can realistically hope to remove from a certain site given persistent effort and a lot of monitoring. Some of the tools or some of the strategies we may use include mechanical control, which essentially is any sort of physical removal of the undesired plant or pest. That could be mowing, cutting, using a handsaw or chainsaw, disking, weeding, which could be hand pulling, anything like that. Like I said, physically removes that plant. Often mechanical control can be effective, but it requires a lot of input in terms of resources and labor. So it's used most effectively in conjunction with other management actions. One of those actions is chemical control. And that could also include several different things. Excuse me. So chemical control in this sense most often refers to the use of herbicides and pesticides to control an unwanted pest, whether that's a non-native invasive plant or in some cases an insecticide to control some of those non-native invasive insects. But one of our key guiding consideration when we're using any chemicals in these sites is safe, responsible, and effective applications. Not only is safety the key goal, but an effective application is important too, because then you're not having to come back and reapply again, adding additional chemical to a system just because you didn't properly address or there was something that was amiss in the first one or two applications. So we need to make sure we're doing it targeted, very responsibly and very effectively. We use selective herbicides or pesticides for specific targets, and we try our best to use low rate applications. And another important step is to bring in native grasses, shrubs, trees, any sort of type of native vegetation that can help restore some of the natural wildlife benefits or resources associated with those plants, but also to provide some competition for those invasives that may be either trying to reestablish or creep in from other areas. All right, so prescribed fire, again, like I said, this is something that we are within the past couple of years embracing a little bit more as a system, as Raleigh Parks goes. It's a common practice throughout the Southeast US and in other parts of the country. And the primary purpose of prescribed fire is to introduce fire in a way that mimics and restores the benefits of natural fire. And I've got that in quotations here because it's kind of a tricky term. It's important to note that ages and ages ago, millennia ago, the Southeast United States, that fire and lightning strike fire typically, but also through indigenous peoples, was a huge part of the landscape, and it really helped shape some of these ecosystems. There are many different fire adapted and fire prone ecosystems still here in the Southeast, along with a bunch of different examples of plant and wildlife species that have adapted to fire disturbance throughout, again, millennia. By reintroducing prescribed fire, you're trying to mimic those same benefits and those same sort of phenomenon, and it aids in vegetation management, nutrient cycling, the succession of natural communities, and a lot more. Prescribed fire, the idea of intentionally introducing fire to a system, whether that's an open field or underneath the canopy of a forest, can be a tricky situation. It can make some people nervous, as is understandable. But controlled burns, the very well planned, very well resourced operations where safety is the highest priority, all the different contingencies and considerations are taken into place during the planning period before any fire is lit. A lot of those revolve around the different weather and fuel conditions and where that smoke is going to go, because you're going to have to plan for the big column of smoke potentially that you're creating. Fire control lines, how are you going to control that fire and keep it in that designated unit? And then contingency plan for what's going to happen if it were to escape. All those things go into the planning process before a fire is even lit. And it's made and designed. Of course, accidents still happen. As an example, I think in the West Coast we had earlier this year. But where we are and where we're using them in terms of Raleigh Parks is going to be very small scale, small acreage, low complexity, low fuel loads, which will reduce smoke management needs. That's how we're going to kind of approach this, because we are, again, in such a heavy urban area. All right, so I kind of wanted to share this example only because we've got some recent news. This is a good concrete example of the city of Raleigh working with partners, not only internally, not only Raleigh Parks working with other divisions and departments within the city government, but with other partners outside. So a few years ago, the upper lake at Durant Nature Preserve, I'm not sure, hopefully some of you all are familiar with the property. There are two impoundment ponds or lakes that have been created, I think back in the 40s, 50s, to prevent downstream flooding and essentially serve as sediment and flood control. A few years ago, the dam that contains the lower lake or impedes the lower lake was replaced. And during that time, or shortly after that, there was a study done on the dam on the upper lake, which is the one kind of seen in the central of that photo. They determined that that dam was going to need repair, serious repair or replacement within the next 5 to 10 years. So Raleigh Parks worked with North Carolina State University to conduct a multi-year study on what may be some of the best alternatives to either replacing the dam or what could we do potentially besides just repairing the dam and keeping everything as is. So the NC State study produced three alternatives. One of those being keep the dam as is, repair it, and maintain the pond. The second alternative was going to be to completely demolish the dam and try to institute some stream restoration practices and create a more natural stream until again it hits the lower lake. Or the third alternative, and what proved to be the most popular and most beneficial, was to convert the upper lake there to a functional wetland. This went through several rounds of public meetings and public comment. And again, everybody sort of supported the idea of converting this to a wetland habitat that not only would be unique to the park, but also would be representative of stuff that's in peril all throughout our region. Like these wetland systems of what we're hoping to create here, there aren't many of those left. And those that are still remaining aren't quite functional, whether it's through different stormwater or sedimentation impacts, surrounding development, all sorts of things. So we applied for a grant through the Land and Water Foundation, which I believe was formerly Clean Water Management Trust Fund. And we just received word this past week that we were awarded a grant of $750,000 to help complete this project. We had asked for $1 million, but we'll take 750. And we've also gotten a pledge of, I believe, 1.5 million from our stormwater division within the city of Raleigh to help make this project a reality. So I believe construction slated to begin next year. It'll be a multi-year process, but maybe in the next 5 to 10 years, we'll have something that looks a lot like what's down in the bottom right-hand corner. Something that provides a diverse set of pools, set of highland areas, wetland areas that will be beneficial to different reptiles, amphibians, insects, mammals, really all sorts of different wildlife. Will be able to take advantage of this improved and again, increasingly more scarce ecosystem. In the upper left there, you can see a rough schematic of what the proposed plan looks like. I'm sure there will be some adjustments, but one of the big elements is the boardwalk, which you may be able to see. So not only are we looking to build this and improve this area for the benefit of wildlife and the benefit of our plant populations, but also to create a tool in a setting where we can bring citizens of Raleigh, we can bring land management professionals, we can bring members of academic institutions, researchers, and show them what's possible if we have collective action in the sense that we had at this time. So again, construction pending 2023, hopefully, and we'll see how this goes. I've touched on it a little bit earlier, but I would really want to highlight the different internal and external partnerships that Raleigh Parks has created and really fostered that help us meet shared goals. So not only within our own city government, within the city of Raleigh, but we work outside with North Carolina State University quite a bit on research projects. We work with Wildlife Resources Commission and the North Carolina Forest Service, or other two good government agencies that we spend a lot of time interacting with, developing best management practices, having them come onto our sites and help us interpret and develop planning tools for how we want to best manage our resources. And also so that they can kind of help educate our staff, keeping our staff up to date on current knowledge and current strategies and trends is a big part of what we do. We do work with a lot of non-government agencies, such as Wake Audubon, the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, Wake Nature Partnership Reserves, and many, many more. I wouldn't be able to even contain all of them in a single slide if I were to try to list all of them, but those are some of the major ones. And the key point is that we are actively working with other groups, government agencies or otherwise, to stay involved, to stay part of this conservation network, whether it's at the local, regional, statewide, or even national scale. Speaking of that, now I want to get into just some of the different initiatives, kind of larger scale collective action initiatives that the city of Raleigh has joined. These could be worldwide, regional, nationwide, statewide. We've got a variety here. So I wanted to highlight some of the more important ones. And I wanted to start with the Biophilic Cities certification, which is a worldwide initiative that we actually just became a part of as a city this year. This quote here is taken directly from the Biophilic Cities website. It states how they partner with different cities and scholars to advocate for the value and contribution of nature in cities and the lives of urban residents. So there's really a central focus on not only ecology, but urban ecology and how that interacts with the people who live in these areas. Partner cities are committed to different conservation practices and different public education and outreach efforts that will help create positive environmental action, not only in their city, but generate trends throughout the region. There are additional initiatives that the city of Raleigh has already been a part of, and a lot of those initiatives really kind of helped bolster our application and gain our acceptance into the Biophilic Cities network. Here's another cool one that I think everybody might be interested in. Raleigh is joined with Wake County Audubon to be a member of the Lights Out program. So a little bit of genesis of this is surveys back in 2013 to 2015 during the migratory seasons of downtown Raleigh. There were, I can't remember the exact number, but let's say hundreds of birds that were observed to have either died through window strikes or through just sheer exhaustion by becoming disoriented by the lights of downtown Raleigh. So typically what you'll see is these birds are moving through en masse. They typically do migrate at night, which complicates matters. And they'll come through and the lights will either disorient them to the point where they are flying during times where they should be resting and reserving those resources, or it attracts them to areas where they may encounter a building or a window. And there were several birds that were dead, several birds that were in sort of exhaustive phases, close to death, that were collected by different volunteers who went and conducted these surveys. And that kind of was a huge eye opener for the city. So since then, we've been participating in Lights Out Raleigh. What we do is we are cutting down lights in places like the Duke Energy Center, the Convention Center, other buildings in downtown Raleigh between the times of 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. during specific migration periods. And I've put kind of the broad migration periods here in parentheses because that's what was given to me by the Wake Audubon folks, sort of between middle March and the end of May, and again between middle September and the end of November. So we are currently in one of those periods, and hopefully if all the communication and rollout has been the same as it has been in previous years, we've got participation downtown. And we are really trying our best to encourage private residents to participate in this too, by, again, either turning off their lights or reducing the lights between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. during these time periods. We do understand that some people, safety is an issue when it comes to lighting. So there are other types of methods that would help achieve the same goal. And one of those is using light shades that will redirect the light down to the ground or even perpendicular, anything that sort of presents the light from projecting upward where these birds are flying through, using things like motion sensors. So the lights will be off until there's some sort of motion detected. And then finally, planting native plants. I know that seems like a little bit of a non sequitur, but that is a huge part of contributing to bird migrations and reducing the amount of mortality that comes through, because those native plants are what those birds are looking for to restore those nutrients and resources, those fat reserves that they're going to need in order to finish their journey. Here are a couple, Tree City USA and the Triangle Tree Initiative are both different partnerships that we've entered that focus on the planting of native trees. So Tree City USA is a partnership with the Arbor Day Foundation. It's where not only are you planting trees, but you're trying to maintain and promote healthy forest in an urban setting that will help promote environmental and health benefits. The Triangle Tree Initiative is a more local initiative that is created or that was started by the Activate Good organization. And then the other big partners there are Project Pando and We Plant It Forward. All of these are nonprofit organizations that do their best to source and provide trees and other plant material to agencies like Raleigh Parks. And we have entered a cooperative commitment with them to try to plant 10,000 native plants across the Triangle area. So not just the city of Raleigh, but throughout the Triangle area in 2022. And this includes city of Durham, I believe Cary's involved. Several other municipalities in the Triangle area are also on board. All right, so for our pollinators, we have several different programs that we're a part of. Bee City USA, Parks for Pollinators, which is actually sponsored by the National Recreation and Parks Association, and Monarch Way Stations, which is sponsored by the Monarch Watch organization. All of these are essentially commitments by the city or by Raleigh Parks to preserve and expand different types of pollinator habitats throughout the city. We've been doing a pretty good job of this, and you may have seen some of these not only in our parks or preserves, but especially along greenways where we have a lot of different wildflower plots that we've established and hope to do a lot more in the coming years. All right, box turtle connection is a cool one that I've had some experience with, but a lot of our other folks are a lot more tuned into. It's where we are tracking and reporting different box turtle observations. They're marking these turtles so that they can report recaptures or new turtles. And by the end of, let's say, a given year, they'll have a much better idea of what those populations are in that given area. Candid Critters was a program that was started, and I'm not even sure if it's still in. I believe COVID threw a wrench in it, and like it did many other things. And so I'm not sure if this is back on track yet, but it was a program that was promoted and ran through the Wildlife Resources Commission, where people and organizations like ourselves would use trail cameras to track and report different wildlife observations over the course of certain periods of the year. And I believe Julia may have been a part of this. And if not, the reason I say that is because Julia and at Lake Johnson, they've collected some of the best wildlife trail camera photos that we have gotten in the whole park system. And I want to share some of those with you guys right now. So up in the upper left, we've got some wood ducks. Bottom left, we've got some beavers. In the bottom right, we've got a gorgeous deer fawn. All of these were collected through Julia's efforts at Lake Johnson, placing trail cameras in the wetland areas above the lake. In the upper middle and the upper right, we've got a bluebird and a bobcat, and these were actually collected at Walnut Creek Wetland Preserve, not that much further down. Now, Julia, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe the bobcat was Walnut Creek.
That is correct. I've been hoping for a bobcat, have yet to get. I've gotten coyote though.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, and I actually used one of your coyote pictures earlier. So trail cameras are a great passive way to collect all sorts of information, not only what types of species, but when they're using it, how often they're using it, and all that will go towards informing our management plan. So that's another program that we're really excited about. Plus, it creates some great pictures and images and also some videos. So this is a video that was collected again at Walnut Creek Wetland Center. Really, I believe that was contained in the map that I showed you earlier. So there is all sorts of stuff that is occurring within the belt line, the inner belt line, that we may be completely unaware of. This is a family of otters that's been living there for several years now and continues to grow and do well. And, you know, they're just such charismatic animals. And it's amazing to think that, you know, you can actually hear the I-40 traffic in the background. So it shows you how important, how functional that these green spaces still are and how important it is for a park system to keep these things going and to keep protecting and expanding these areas so we can continue to have a full family of otters persisting in one of our sites. All right, so we've talked a lot about how Raleigh Parks addresses these issues, but we also wanted to highlight some of the things you as individuals can do to help, or, as collective action groups, whether that's in your neighborhood, your church group, your sports group, anything like that. And we'll start with one of the most important things, and that's planting native plants in your yards and throughout your neighborhoods, as opposed to non-native ornamentals, which are obviously very popular. People in landscaping use things that are easy to maintain, things that are very pretty and attractive, things that stay green year round, but aren't necessarily from this area and don't provide any real natural resource to the wildlife. Not only that, they outcompete native plants when they escape some of these landscaped areas, so that it becomes an even bigger drain on the resources. One good strategy that we've learned, and maybe others can explore, is working with different homeowner associations to create standards, or at least encourage the use of native plants in yards and landscaping, sort of communal landscaping areas. Another thing you can do is reduce the amount of area that you mow and reduce the amount of the frequency in which you mow it. So by allowing certain areas, if it's not part of your lawn necessarily, but let's say you have a larger lot and some of that you can afford to allow to grow up and maybe mow it once or twice a year instead of once, every couple of weeks during the summertime, that will help generate that seed bank and that root base for different native plants. Again, providing more wildlife resource. Protect the riparian buffers near you and your neighborhoods. Riparian buffers are the areas closest to streams, rivers, lakes, and wetlands. And by protecting those and keeping those maintained, you are essentially providing a buffer for different runoff, whether it's through stormwater activities or whatnot, filtration type buffer that will help prevent different contaminants from entering the water. The wider the buffer, the better. But as you saw in the earlier slide where I showed you the map of Raleigh, these buffers are getting fairly constricted by development. So residential buffers, or buffers in residential areas, are becoming even more important because there's a little bit more autonomy that the landowner has with choosing how they want to treat those areas. Properly dispose of your waste, whether it's household garbage or your yard clippings or your yard waste. Household garbage, obviously, we understand the detriments of litter and of contamination of getting garbage and refuse out, but also your yard waste. We've had several instances, and Lake Johnson, where Julia works, is another example of where people were taking their yard waste, their yard clippings, and throwing them into the park, which was adjacent to their backyards. Essentially, they were the neighbors of the park. And before you knew it, we had all of these non-native invasives start to take hold and become established. And now that area is one of the most invaded sections of the park, where we've spent a lot of time, a lot of money, and a lot of resources trying to remove some of these species, these invasive species that were introduced by our neighbors, unintentionally, granted, but by educating people on what to do with those sort of things, hopefully we can prevent that in the future. One thing I really want to highlight, because this is something I've only recently become aware of, please do not mix household garbage and yard waste. If you live in an area where you have yard waste collection through City of Raleigh, please do your best to maintain that as yard waste and household garbage separately. We have a lot of examples where that yard waste goes to the yard waste center. It is ground into mulch, and then that mulch is then used to be put around tree beds, flower beds, trails, other areas throughout the city of Raleigh. And when people are throwing in garbage bags and other things into the yard waste, there's not the technology or the capacity in some cases to separate those once they get to the center. So what we end up with is a bunch of plastic pieces, metal pieces in the mulch that then gets distributed all throughout the city. So we're working on our end to try to prevent that from happening, but something people can do is making sure that they do not mix their yard waste and their household waste. Something else you can do is participate in Lights Out Raleigh and some of those other initiatives we talked about, whether that's the box turtle or the Candid Critters or any of those other things that kind of piqued your interest. You can go online and find any number of resources and different types of initiatives where you as individuals can take action that will contribute to the overall goal. And some of the more specific things we do in parks are different volunteer community science programs and different outreach events, including BioBlitz events, which can be 1 day or sometimes multi-day events where we are getting as much information as we can about the different plant and wildlife and insect and all these different whatever's living. It's a blitz of a survey to figure out and identify as much or as many different plants and wildlife species we can in a single site in a given day or a given period of time. Those are a lot of fun, just typically because there's a lot of other good stuff that goes along with it. And we also have a lot of participation from experts and different professionals from around the area. So not only is it fun, but it's also very educational. We like to promote the use of iNaturalist and Seek, which Seek is a product of iNaturalist. These are smartphone apps that can help identify and collect and go ahead and report observations that you may make of different plant and wildlife species, whether that's in your own yard, in your neighborhood, or in any of the Raleigh parks or nature preserves or greenway areas. All that information we can then collect and consolidate and take that to help us guide our management decisions going forward. So I would totally encourage you all to look into iNaturalist and Seek. And there are other smartphone apps. I think Picture This is another one. But there are several ways to use the technology we have and we carry around in our pockets every day in the smartphone to help benefit not only our city initiatives when it comes to natural resource management, but even beyond that. There are other biological inventory platforms you could enter information into. For example, if you're a birder, you can go to eBird, post what you've seen in our sites, and we will, I think it's once or twice a month now, we are going to go up there and kind of glean the information and add that to our overall inventories. Stuff like Herp Mapper for reptiles and amphibians. And there are, again, several others out there where it may require a membership or at least creation of an account. But once you do that, you are then contributing to the overall body of data that we as land managers use to make management decisions. And then lastly is the good old fashioned way of getting out and sweating during a volunteer workday. We do have a lot of invasive species removal days. We do have some that are centered around monitoring and collecting data. And we have some that are on, facility stuff like trails, for example. So check out the City of Raleigh website. And if you just search volunteer opportunities in the search bar, you should be able to come up with the volunteer services page, and you'll have a buffet list of different opportunities you can assist with if you feel so inclined. All right, so that's going to wrap us up. I thank you all for watching. Hopefully I didn't drone on too long. I have no idea where I am with time, but please, any questions are more than welcome. And there at the bottom, you'll see my contact info if you want to shoot me an email. I can follow up with you after the fact. And Julia, what I want to do is I will share this presentation with you, and so you can distribute it to everybody who's interested, but also a list of those links. So for example, all these other initiatives, Box Turtle, Candid Critters, Bee City, I'd like to send you links for those too, so folks can look more into those and see if they want to join, and again, help us build our body of knowledge and help us better manage our resources, which is the name of the game. So again, thanks for watching. I'll stop sharing my screen and happy to take questions if anybody's got any.
Yeah, so if anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself using the little microphone icon. Or if you'd rather, you can throw it in the chat and I'll read it out to Sean to answer the question. And as far as all the slide deck and the links, I will send that out to everybody when I send out the EE form, as well as a link to the recording of the presentation. And I guess I can get us kicked off with, so you had mentioned, participating in BioBlitzes with us. Is there a way that the public can kind of see outside of our volunteer services page, which I know is great for volunteer opportunities, on how to participate in different initiatives or programs that we're doing, such as BioBlitzes, without knowing ahead of time, oh, this park is doing one on this date. I know we've done a couple of stuff with that, but is that something we've got like a landing page created that people can just go to and see what's coming up?
Yeah. I think the City of Raleigh website is going to be your best resource, because not only do we have individual pages for different types of those BioBlitz events, but then we have the volunteer services link, which is where we put any sort of BioBlitz event where we are taking public volunteers. We do have the occasional BioBlitz, and this is often led by Wake Nature, which is an organization of natural resource professionals, and it's almost sort of a bidding process where we as Raleigh Parks put in an application to have them come to us and do a bio blitz where it's, it's strictly the professionals, and they come in and they really help identify and collect a wide variety of things. And that is really valuable, but just as valuable is having the citizen science or community science aspect. And so by going on the Raleigh Parks website, that's going to be your best bet to find that information. Um, Additional resources could include the NRPA, the National Recreation and Parks Association website, where they are often sometimes leading bio blitzes. And then I would suggest the Wildlife Resources Commission, because they are also pretty heavily involved in different inventory type efforts like the Candid Critters, the Box Turtle Connection, and other things like that.
So we got a question in the chat. I can speak to Lake Johnson and Sean. I'll let you speak to the rest of the natural resources team. But the question is, do you park staff monitor bluebird boxes at the parks and preserves, or do you rely on volunteers to do this type of job? Bluebird boxes are often taken over by English house sparrows, a non-native invasive species. So us at Lake Johnson, we do not have any active bluebird boxes at this time. We're actually in the process of working with Sean to do a restore, or to restore some of our property into a meadow. So if you've been to our park before, the parking lot that is off of Lake Dam Road, just up trail, we're still working on getting some clear signage there, but if you come up the greenway a bit, you'll see a dirt path up to a large open field area that used to actually a long time ago be a residential area, and in there we've actually started doing some meadow restoration. So for us, eventually, hopefully we'll get some bluebird boxes out there, but I do know a number of our parks do have bluebird boxes.
Yeah, that's a great question. We do have, I would be wrong if I tried to guess the number of sites, but over a dozen sites that have bluebird boxes that are monitored by volunteers. And that is a sort of cooperative effort between us and Wake Audubon. We had a employee for a long time. Her name was Marty Kane. She was the manager over at Wilkerson Nature Preserve, and she helped get a lot of that stuff started. But then not only that, after she retired, she helped maintain the monitoring strategy. She got us involved with Nest Watch, which is where we can report all of these different observations, whether the bluebird box was successful and how many fledglings they had, or if a house wren or house sparrow or a rat snake or something had come in and predated the nest and we need to move it. So there is a network of volunteers that does this monitoring for us at several different sites where we have it established. And then again, we report all those things to Nest Watch under our Nest Watch account. And if you're interested in joining us, let me know, because I can get you tuned into the Wake Audubon folks who are coordinating the volunteers, in case you are curious about helping out and doing some monitoring for us. The season's coming up, so.
I'll definitely pass your contact information along with the email. And really, if you're really looking to get involved with the city park system as a volunteer in any capacity, looking at our, and I'll include the link directly to it, but our volunteer services page is a great way. We definitely do a lot with volunteers within the parks for various things. All right, so we got another question. Have you burned any of the city properties yet? And if so, what areas? So Sean, I'll let you speak to that since you're the one that kind of spearheads all of that.
Yeah. So we've been lucky enough to work with the Forest Service to accomplish a couple of burns in the past few years. Before I joined Raleigh Parks, they did a burn back in 2017 at Wilkerson Nature Preserve in some of the bigger, more open fields. I'm not sure if you all are familiar with it, but since I've been a part of Raleigh Parks, we were able to burn at Wilkerson Nature Preserve 3 times. Once in a large portion of that herbaceous field, that grass field, and then twice in a smaller, more targeted area that we identified as having a high biodiversity that was left over from the old cow farming days at Wilkerson. So Wilkerson Nature Preserve, Annie Louise Wilkerson Nature Preserve, before Dr. Annie bought it, and I believe even after she had it, was a cow farm. So there was a lot of browsing and a lot of pasturing, and that created sort of a negative impact, not only in the fields, but these cows were allowed to roam all throughout the woods. And that browsing pressure helped reduce the different biodiversity of plants throughout the area. There was one patch that we identified that was fenced off from the browsing, was part of the yard of the original house, I believe. And so we've applied prescribed fire there twice now. And after the first time, we had a plant show up in that area that hadn't been seen in North Carolina in 50 years. It's called Redwood Lettuce. It's Latuca hirsuta, I believe, is the scientific name. And that's something I wanted to include in the presentation, but didn't want to get too long-winded. So by identifying these areas properly, by applying the fire properly, we have proven that even just in a couple burns, we were able to restore something or bring something back that had been missing for many, many years. So not only have we done the burns at Wilkerson, but we did do one at Lake Johnson in the southeast area. There's a portion of the Greenway that comes around and forms the Scenic Overlook Loop, I believe it's called, or Scenic Loop. And so it's a 2-acre area of forest that still contains a lot of fire-prone species and fire-adapted species. And it's contained within sort of a donut of Greenway, which creates the perfect control line. So yeah, we were able to burn there too. That was back in 2021. Unfortunately, we didn't get any burns yet, sort of at the beginning of 21, but now we're looking at getting hopefully something done before the end of this year at additional areas. Horseshoe Farm is something we're looking at. Anderson Point is somewhere we're looking at. Areas where we think fire would not only be most appropriate, but would provide the biggest ecological boost. So yeah, we're working on it, and we're rapidly, hopefully, building to using that more readily.
I will say for the burn with Lake Johnson, for somebody that works for the park, that was something I was very excited to see. I honestly didn't think that was something I'd ever seen in my lifetime in my career there. But that's something too. It just goes to show that, this is something that you can implement into urban parks. I know the town of Cary has done this frequently over at Hemlock Bluffs, to where it's now common practice with them for prescribed burn. So it's something that Sean's working now to looking at as the city is it utilizing it as a management tool where appropriate.
Yeah, and Prairie Ridge Ecostation is another
Yep.
good example of a local area that burns a lot. If you look even further up, like Shink Forest, there are places in the region that do prescribe burning quite regularly, and we, as a Raleigh Park system, are trying to catch up. Wake County Open Space is another good example. So we are working with all of these different partners to learn the best ways to implement a fire program in an urban environment where we may be burning. Lake Johnson burn was less than a half a mile from Interstate 40. And we had to worry, we had to pick the right day where the wind was blowing in the right direction and pushing the smoke out over the lake. And it's a very tense and pressurized situation sometimes when you're burning in these environments. But that doesn't mean, and I'm happy that our administration has embraced this. That doesn't mean we should shy away from it. We should try to explore and implement it where we can, when it's safe and when it's going to be effective. So we're in the middle of building up our own internal program. We do rely on a lot of external partners right now, but hopefully in the next year or two, we'll have a Raleigh Parks burn crew that is able to go around and burn some of these smaller acreage, low complexity burns. And yeah, we'll see some huge benefits. And I should add, every burn opportunity or event is preceded by notifications of the neighbors, notifications through our social media, our websites, and then they're followed up with educational signage and different programs that can not only explain the benefits of prescribed burning, but actually highlight and show you firsthand, here's something that was created or that has responded to fire management. And that would be a really neat aspect of it that will expand along with the actual burning component.
So we had another question specific to the invasive species work. They're asking, is this done in-house with volunteers or with contractors?
That's a great question, and it's all of the above. We, for the longest time, had our invasive species program housed underneath volunteer services, which created a great opportunity for volunteers to get out and engage in invasive species removal. But we realized that was kind of hampering our invasive species coordinator or the program manager from being able to get out and do more of these large scale invasive species control projects and work with contractors, and not only contractors, but other agencies that are willing to come in and lend us a hand. So now we're kind of restructuring a little bit. We've built it out. A lot of what we do is in-house. And I would say, maybe a third of what we do is with volunteers or other agencies that are reaching out and contributing. And then an even smaller fraction, I'm not even 100% sure, would be through contract work. When we do contract work, it's typically to sort of invest that in mechanical removal effort right up front. So let's say we have an area that's just overrun with kudzu or wisteria, and it would take us as an agency months or years to really kind of whittle it down. We can contract certain invasive species removal experts who have equipment and knowledge and tools to sort of get that under control to a point where we can then follow up with sort of a maintenance type schedule and control type schedule where we're going to continue to stay on top of it, reduce it, and hopefully maybe eventually eliminate it in some areas. But yeah, I'd say the majority is in-house, followed by volunteer and cooperative agency work, and then contractors as sort of a last resort for the most heavy lifting parts.
Right, well, we have reached the end of our time. Again, thank you so much, Sean, for joining us and kind of sharing kind of some of the projects that the city of Raleigh is working on, and congratulations on getting that grant. That's super exciting to hear. I can't wait to see what comes out of that project. Thank you all, everyone, for joining us tonight. I will be sending out an email again later this week with a link to the recording, as well as some information that Sean is sharing with us, and a link to our volunteer services page. I hope you'll join us in November for our next speaker. You can register for that online, just like you did for this course. And have a great night, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it. Thank you, Julia.